She was 14 years old when they dressed her in bridal white and delivered her to a man 3 decades older, a man everyone at court mocked as a stammering fool, a man who would one day become emperor and sign her death warrant. Her name was Valeria Messalina, and before she became Rome's most infamous empress, she was simply a girl from an aristocratic family caught in political currents far beyond her control or comprehension. The year was 38 CE, and Rome was ruled by the unstable Emperor Caligula, whose court was a labyrinth of surveillance and sudden death, where survival required constant performance and absolute submission to imperial whims. Messalina's marriage to Claudius was not a love match but a political calculation made by her family to secure protection through alliance with the imperial bloodline during increasingly dangerous times. Claudius himself was considered a laughingstock by Roman elite, a limping scholar with a speech impediment who had survived multiple imperial purges precisely because no one considered him a threat worth eliminating. No one asked Messalina whether she wanted to marry this awkward older man, because Roman girls were not consulted about their futures any more than furniture was consulted about its placement. She left her mother's house and entered a new life where every word she spoke would be reported, every friendship analyzed for political implications, and every mistake potentially fatal. The marriage initially offered what passed for safety in Caligula's Rome, but safety in that court was always temporary, always conditional, always one imperial mood swing away from disappearing entirely. Messalina bore her first child within a year, a daughter named Claudia Octavia, and discovered that motherhood in the imperial family was not a private joy but a public obligation monitored by dozens of watching eyes. Her body was not her own but belonged to the dynasty, and her children were not simply her children but potential heirs whose existence carried political weight that attracted both allies and enemies. Caligula was assassinated in 41 CE, and in the chaos that followed, the Praetorian Guard declared Claudius emperor, transforming Messalina overnight from the wife of a ridiculed scholar into the most powerful woman in Rome. She was 17 years old, and the empire that now looked to her as empress was the same empire that had taught her since childhood that women survived only through manipulation and men survived only through violence. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill became her prison as much as her home. A sprawling complex, where slaves reported conversations to freedmen, who reported to secretaries, who reported to whoever currently held the emperor's ear. Claudius relied heavily on freed slaves as advisors, men like Narcissus and Pallas and Callistus, who wielded enormous power and who immediately recognized Messalina as either a potential ally or a potential obstacle. These freedmen had risen from slavery through intelligence and ruthlessness, and they understood that their positions depended entirely on imperial favor, which meant controlling access to the emperor himself. Messalina found herself in competition with former slaves for influence over her own husband, a humiliation that Roman aristocrats considered almost unbearable for a woman of her noble bloodline. She responded to this power struggle the only way the imperial court had taught her, by building networks of loyalty, rewarding supporters, and eliminating anyone who threatened her position or her children's futures. The court watched her every move with the same intensity they had watched every empress before her, waiting for mistakes that could be exploited or scandals that could be manufactured. Roman historians would later paint her as uniquely corrupt, but the tactics she employed were identical to those used by every powerful figure in Roman politics, regardless of gender. She secured favorable marriages for allies, arranged for enemies to face prosecution, and ensured that her son Britannicus was recognized as Claudius's heir, protecting his position against any rivals. Every action she took was scrutinized through the lens of female transgression, and behaviors that were celebrated as cunning in men were condemned as scheming in the emperor's wife. She was 19 years old when the campaign to destroy her reputation began, whispered accusations that grew louder with each passing month, stories that would eventually fill the pages of Roman historians. The accusations focused obsessively on her personal life, transforming political maneuvering into sexual scandal because Roman society could not comprehend female ambition except as sexual deviance. Messalina's actual crimes, if they occurred, were the same crimes every powerful Roman committed: corruption, favoritism, conspiracy, and the ruthless elimination of opponents through legal mechanisms turned into weapons. But history would not remember her as a politician who failed. History would remember her as a woman whose body was the site of her transgression, whose desires were her defining characteristic. The freedmen who competed with her for Claudius's attention had every incentive to poison the emperor's mind against his young wife, and they possessed complete control over what information reached him. Claudius was a scholar who preferred books to court intrigue, a man who had survived by not paying attention to politics, a husband who likely had no idea what games were being played around him. By 48 CE, Messalina had been empress for 7 years and mother for 8, and she had reached the ancient age of 23 in a court that had been trying to destroy her since she arrived as a child bride. The final conspiracy began in autumn, and it centered on a man named Gaius Silius, a consul-elect who was either Messalina's political ally or her lover, or simply a convenient target for her enemies. What actually happened has been debated for 2,000 years. Ancient sources claim Messalina publicly married Silius while Claudius was away, but modern historians question whether this account is propaganda. The idea that an empress would publicly commit bigamy, an obvious capital crime, in front of witnesses while her husband the emperor still lived defies political logic and suggests invention. More likely, Messalina was involved in a political alliance that her enemies chose to characterize as sexual, using Roman assumptions about women to transform politics into scandal. The freedman Narcissus saw his opportunity and moved with the ruthless efficiency that had elevated him from slavery to become one of the most powerful men in the empire. He waited until Claudius was away from Rome, then carefully controlled what information reached the emperor, presenting the situation in terms designed to provoke maximum outrage and minimum reflection. Claudius returned to Rome in a state of confusion and fear, unsure whether to believe the accusations against his wife, but surrounded by advisors who insisted her guilt was absolute. Messalina was not granted an audience with her husband to present her side, because Narcissus understood that giving her access to Claudius risked undoing everything his careful manipulation had achieved. Instead, she was isolated in the gardens of Lucullus, a property she had allegedly obtained through corruption, surrounded by guards and prevented from communicating with anyone who might help her. Her mother Lepida came to her during those final hours, the first time in years the older woman had shown her daughter affection, now that affection could no longer provide any protection. Lepida reportedly urged Messalina to take her own life while she still had the choice, to die with the dignity that Roman aristocrats valued more than survival itself. But Messalina could not bring herself to die while hope remained, while she still believed that if Claudius saw her face, heard her voice, remembered their children, he might show mercy. She waited for a summons that never came, because Narcissus had positioned himself as the essential intermediary and had no intention of allowing husband and wife to speak directly. The children she had borne Claudius were not brought to her, because children might evoke sympathy, and sympathy was the one thing Narcissus could not afford to let the emperor feel. Britannicus and Octavia would grow up without their mother, would be told she was a monster whose death had been necessary, would carry the weight of her disgrace throughout their own tragic lives. When it became clear that no mercy would come, that Claudius had authorized her execution through intermediaries without ever confronting her in person, Messalina still could not end her own life. A tribune and a freedman were sent to complete what she could not begin, and they found her in the gardens, still waiting for a message from a husband who had already moved on. The ancient sources describe her death with a coldness that suggests they considered it merely the appropriate ending for a woman who had transgressed the boundaries Roman society established for her gender. She was 23 years old, and she had been empress for 7 years, and she had been a wife since 14, and she had never been allowed to be simply herself. Her body was not displayed publicly, and her name was ordered erased from public monuments, as if she could be deleted from history as easily as words could be chiseled from stone. But erasure proved impossible, because Rome needed Messalina as a warning, as an example of what happened to women who sought power, as a cautionary tale told to daughters for generations. The historians who wrote about her were all men, writing decades after her death, recording gossip and propaganda as if it were fact, competing to produce the most outrageous anecdotes. Tacitus and Suetonius and Cassius Dio and Juvenal created a Messalina so extreme, so cartoonishly wicked, that she ceased to be human and became simply a symbol of female corruption. They described behaviors so outlandish that they defy biological possibility, accusations so extreme that they reveal more about Roman male anxiety than about any actual woman who lived and died. Every sexual rumor that had circulated in the court, every story invented by enemies, every exaggeration designed to entertain readers was incorporated into her biography as established fact. The real Messalina, the teenage girl married to a much older man, the young mother navigating an impossibly dangerous court, the political player who lost to more ruthless opponents, disappeared beneath the legend. She was replaced by a monster who conveniently justified everything Roman society wanted to believe about women who sought influence beyond the spinning room and the nursery. Her children suffered for her disgrace. Britannicus was eventually poisoned by Nero, and Octavia was executed by the same emperor after a marriage filled with misery and humiliation. The dynasty she had tried to protect through her political maneuvering destroyed itself within a generation, suggesting that her enemy's victory was ultimately as hollow as her defeat. Modern historians have begun to question the ancient accounts, noting the patterns of propaganda, the impossible details, the way her story mirrors other destroyed women whose reputations were demolished after death. They point out that we have no documents written by Messalina herself, no defense of her actions in her own words, no counter-narrative to the one her destroyers crafted. We have only the version of her story that her enemies wanted remembered, repeated so often across so many centuries that it acquired the weight of truth through sheer repetition. The forbidden court behaviors that Rome tried to conceal may not have been Messalina's behaviors at all, but rather the court's own treatment of a young woman who threatened powerful interests. The real scandal may have been how easily a teenager was delivered into a dangerous marriage, how completely she was isolated from family and allies, how efficiently she was eliminated when she became inconvenient. Rome presented itself as a civilization of law and order, but its treatment of Messalina reveals a system where accusations were sufficient, for execution and defense was a privilege that could be denied. The court behaviors that should disturb us are not the invented sexual transgressions of a dead empress, but the very real machinery of surveillance and destruction that operated in plain sight. Every courtier who reported Messalina's conversations, every freedman who blocked her access to her husband, every guard who prevented her from seeing her children, participated in her destruction. They were not punished for these behaviors because these behaviors served imperial interests, and serving imperial interests was the highest virtue the Roman court recognized. Messalina died because she lost a political struggle against opponents who controlled information flow to the one person whose opinion mattered, and she lost because she was never given a chance to compete fairly. The rules of the game were written by men who could accuse women of sexual transgression without evidence and expect those accusations to be believed simply because they aligned with cultural assumptions. 2,000 years later, we still repeat the stories they told about her, still call her name as shorthand for female corruption, still use her as a warning against women who seek power. The forbidden behaviors that Rome tried to conceal were the ordinary operations of imperial power, the political marriages of children, the surveillance of wives, the elimination of inconvenient people through manufactured scandal. These behaviors were not forbidden at all, but rather standard practice, and the only thing concealed was how normal they were, how systematic, how completely acceptable to a society that called itself civilized. Messalina's story is not the story of a uniquely wicked woman, but the story of a system that consumed women like fuel, that married them as children and discarded them when their utility expired. She was not the first empress to be destroyed by the court, and she would not be the last, and each one would be remembered through the propaganda of her destroyers rather than the reality of her experience. What Rome actually concealed was not Messalina's behavior but its own, the ugly machinery of power that operated behind the marble facades and the noble rhetoric about Roman virtue. Tonight, if you walk the Palatine Hill where she once lived and died, you can still see the foundations of the palace that was her prison, the stones that watched her final days. The tourists who visit do not think of her as a person who suffered there, but as a character from scandalous stories, a villain in the drama of imperial Rome. But she was human before she was legend, and she was young before she was notorious, and she was someone's daughter before she was everyone's cautionary tale. The forbidden court behaviors were real, but they were not Messalina's behaviors. They were Rome's, and we are still concealing them every time we repeat the propaganda and forget the person who was destroyed to create it. Her name was Valeria Messalina, and she deserved better than history gave her. And history gave her only what her destroyers designed,